Hello and welcome to my presentation about the Equifax breach. In the words of Senator Warren, the whole thing is staggering. A company like Equifax that has sensitive personal information on most Americans, they should have the best data security in the industry. And instead it has the worst, and I want to understand why. Well, indeed, I do too, and hopefully we'll have some hints. So what happened? In 2017, Equifax, one of the three credit bureaus that hold our most sensitive, personally identifiable information, did suffer from a data breach. It was one of the worst breaches in U.S. history. Worse, the executives disclosed this breach very late in the game, while they discovered the breach on around July 29th. Now, some executives had even sold their stock in early September before they disclosed the breach and before Equifax's stock plummeted. Now, instead of taking accountability, the CEO actually blamed an engineer, while most of these senior executives were given golden parachutes and retired with millions. So, you probably are affected by this, whether you know it or not. So, what did they steal? Social security numbers, customer names, birth dates, email addresses, driver's license numbers, and even credit card numbers in some cases. Now, if you look at the statistics here, one of the most interesting ones is the last one, 0, number of fraud or identity theft cases that can be traced back to this incident. Now that it will be an interesting thing. Where did all the stolen data go? Hopefully we'll find out. So how did it happen? Well, back then, an Apache Struts vulnerability was not properly identified, and I want you to remember that word identified as being present on a public website when patches were being installed. Also, an expired digital certificate contributed to their ability to communicate with compromised servers and allowed them to exfiltrate the data without being detected. Because individual databases were not segmented from each other, they gained access to even more databases. This went on until they got unencrypted credentials, and soon they had unfettered access. So this is the vulnerability in question, and it was deemed critical. But on March 7th, Apache announced that they had a patch for this. And just the day afterwards, the Department of Homeland Security notified Equifax specifically. Now, it's important to note that on Apache's website, they even mentioned it is best to think in terms of hours or a few days, not weeks or months, because we all know it's a best cybersecurity practice to make sure you promptly update your patches. Now, this is a wonderful figure that comes from the GAO office and describes how the hackers went about doing this. They first scanned the web for vulnerable servers, finding one such as the Equifax dispute portal, which was compromised with this vulnerability, and they were able to continue to have access unfettered because the security certificate had expired, and instead of triggering an alert, they wanted to make sure that people could still access the software. So basically, Equifax was blind as hackers were able to exfiltrate data without anybody knowing about it. This is a timeline that shows pretty much the grand scheme of things. Now, over on the far left, that's the date that the Department of Homeland Security notified Equifax. September 7th is the day that they publicly announced the breach. September 15th, the CSO and the CIO both resign. September 26th, Smith, the CEO, resigns. So, the reason I said to remember identify is because when we're thinking about strategy, it's important to be able to see what you want to protect, because if you can't see it, you can't protect it. And I think NIST is one of the best frameworks because it's intuitive and customizable, and it's gaining popularity throughout the world. And it's important to be able to look at Equifax through these different functions, whether it's protect, detect, respond, or recover. Did they have anti-intrusion software? Were they doing vulnerability scanning? Did they have a good incident response team? Did they have any penetration testing? So this is a great starting place to look at strategy. Now, because there are many different components of cybersecurity, I can only pick on a few topics that I think are foundational to best cybersecurity practices, and I would put building a security culture right at the top of that list, and creating cybersecurity awareness. And that means at the C-level suite throughout a company. So Equifax, it was known at the October hearings, was already in trouble for having prior data breaches, just not as significant as this one, and they were also known for having poor cybersecurity posture. So why? They had sufficient resources, they could afford the best cybersecurity, so why were they not able to respond or mitigate these attacks? Because according to the Government Accountability Office, this breach was, quote, completely preventable. So that's a question to think on. Why was Equifax not showing best cybersecurity practices? That's the big question. In my opinion, it comes down to governance, although there are many different reasons. But if I had to sum it up in a slide or in a sentence, one answer to the conundrum might be that there was a perfect storm, a culture of complacency that was embedded with an unaccountable bureaucracy that did not have a proactive security posture. Speaking of data accountability, in the European Union, they have legislation that is more robust than what we have in the United States. In California, where I live, we do have better privacy protections, but the GDPR, which governs the European Union, is a much better method for protecting your own privacy. It has things like right to erasing your data if they do not need it anymore, along with many other things. So would this have helped companies be more accountable because their revenue would be on the line? It's something to consider, because perhaps they might act as better shepherds of our personal data if their revenue was dependent upon good custodianship. So if I want to talk about different strategies, I want to think about those that are foundational and those that can apply to most scenarios. And at the top of that list would also be identity and access management. We want to increase our security posture by layering our defenses and striving for true defense in depth. And one pillar of that would be IAM management, or privileged access management. So we can know who is getting what privileges, and we are following the principle of least privileges. And I also want to guide you to the practice of identification, authentication, authorization, and auditing. Auditing, for example, could have been something that they did annually at Equifax, let's say over security certificates, find out if any of it had been expired, and that could have been an example where you could have mitigated something right there. Also, this would cover best practices such as multi-factor authentication, good password hygiene, and covers a lot of bases. And that also leads me to secure system administration, because who has the most privileges and the most access but system administrators? But this also relates to the secure development lifecycle. Why weren't those patches updated promptly? Well, it's not like an iPhone app and you just push a button. Unfortunately, with the software and the tech in question, modifications needed to be made within the source code, and therefore there was already a vulnerability in terms of the nature of whether they were baking in software at the outset, which I think is a better practice. And so I think taking a look at secure architecture is a key aspect and another pillar for defense in depth. Finally, offensive cybersecurity as a way to authenticate your own defensive posture should be a key cornerstone, because you can have a security operations center, but when they are handling a real event, that's when it all kind of comes together, because a penetration test not only shows you vulnerabilities or security gaps, but it allows you to know if the controls you have in place are actually working and doing their job. And it's better to find out under conditions that are controlled and circumstances that are controlled, because in effect the 2017 breach was like one big penetration test that was not a test. It wasn't a drill, and there were casualties, and that was our personal data. But it had the effect of teaching them a rather expensive lesson, and they had to rebuild their security infrastructure. So had they had some of these things in place, offensive cybersecurity, in order to ensure they have the right controls, this also would have helped strategically to make sure that they were ahead of the curve. So, upon noting the widespread nature of their failure, from governance down to implementing best security practices, I would personally suggest that Equifax rebuild their security infrastructure from the ground up, taking into account the foundational principles that I just mentioned above. And guess what? That is what they did, and they built it from the ground up. They learned their lesson, and they brought in a new team with essentially a blank check, and they actually did a wonderful job. And I just want to quote from one of their security reports from 2020: "A security-first culture is the foundation of our success. Every year, their employees receive customized training, personalized scorecards, and simulation to keep their skills sharp." I think this is fascinating because that was a source that I got to late in my research. And so I think that means that they are on the right road. And sure enough, though it took some harsh real-world lessons and the disaster would humble the company, it would actually lead them to harden their defenses and rebuild their cybersecurity infrastructure. So their work would bear fruit, as the company now stands as one of the most secure in the world, as demonstrated by this graph. Now, the financial services in general have some of the best cybersecurity practices short of the military. So Equifax, though it was humbled in 2017, learned from that lesson and now has one of the best security infrastructure in the world. Now, who was behind all of this? Well, it turns out that the people that could find zero evidence of where that information went, there was a reason for that. Typically, with hackers, you would look to find information on the black market, which would be, in this case, the dark web. But investigators hunted and hunted, and they couldn't find anything. 17 months later, they put together the TTP of Chinese fingerprints along with the analysis of intelligence professionals, and they figured out this was a nation-state espionage operation, particularly sponsored by the Chinese military. Now, what they did with this information is anybody's guess. They could use it for leverage against people that they might want to blackmail, or they could flip an election. They could do anything, but having that intelligence on American citizens allows them to conduct operations. So it's one of those things, and China, it should be noted, is one of the preeminent superpowers when it comes to cyber warfare and cyber operations. When it comes to the sources, I'm sorry it's hard to read here, but I recommend the Equifax security documents themselves, but also the government reports, whether it's the initial hearings in October of 2017 or the Government Accountability Office's documents. They go through and they collect everything. And I would love to have listed it here, but it would be too much information. But I want to thank you all for listening and watching, and special thanks to Jason, to Patrick, to Heather, and to Emeritus, MIT, and everybody else who helped in guiding the creation of this presentation. Thank you so much for watching and listening, and have a wonderful day.